Welcome back to Inside the Story. Today we're talking about a figure who, with his personality, his political ideas, and his decisions, shaped a significant part of the second half of the 20th century. A South American figure, someone who influenced not only the events of his own country, but also, indirectly, through his decisions and by associating with certain people along his personal journey, with the possibility of having further repercussions on neighboring states throughout the entire American continent, not just the South American subcontinent, and in some ways with effects even in Europe, including Italy. Today we are talking about Juan Domingo Perón, a man who meant a lot to his country, Argentina, but if you look closely, he was also a sort of historiographical problem, because Perón was one of the most complex and controversial cases in the political history of 20th century Latin America. Much more than just a political leader, founder of a movement, Peronism, which has spanned the ages, has changed languages, programs, and has continued to exert a decisive influence on Argentine political life, well beyond the death of its creator. After all, Perón himself has always had a very polarizing character. Since the 1940s and 1950s, his political ideas have been alternately interpreted as an authoritarian degeneration of liberal democracy, a form of mass populism, an original response to the limits of dependent capitalism, a kind of modern Bonapartism, or an experience of social integration for the subordinate classes. However, these are all academic interpretations, and to truly understand who Juan Domingo Perón was, we need to delve deeply into our history, as is our custom. The first major interpretative trend that dominated in the years immediately following the fall of Perón was the liberal and anti-Peronist one. But why? For what reason? Because Perón had probably broken the mold. According to the anti-Peronist interpretation, Peronism was a sort of authoritarian and demagogic parenthesis in Argentine history, based on the manipulation of the masses. The famous descamisados, that is, the shirtless ones, on the cult of personality, as happened in the great dictatorships, and on the destruction of republican institutions. From this perspective, Perón has been compared to European fascism, although in a somewhat milder form. Starting from the 1960s and 70s, a second line of interpretation emerged, influenced by dependency theory. Authors like Gino Germani and later Ernesto Laclau interpreted Peronism as a form of populism, deriving from an incomplete modernization in which the recently proletarianized urban masses are politically integrated through a national and cross-class path. In this sense, Perón would not be a simple demagogue, but the structural product of the economic and, above all, social transformations of 20th century Argentina. Then there are other schools of thought, the so-called national popular one, which has reevaluated the Peronist experience as an attempt to build an autonomous welfare state capable of freeing itself from economic subordination to the central powers. But to really understand who Juan Domingo Perón was, as we said, you have to go deeper. So, Perón was born in 1995 into a modest provincial family far from the land-owning oligarchy that ruled over the vast Pampas countryside, and also far from the emerging urban sectors. This social background, sometimes disputed, some have even said that Perón had very distant Sardinian origins, but emphasized by revisionist historians, contributed to the resulting confusion. Perón was an intermediary, equidistant, able to understand both the culture of the elite Argentinians of European descent, who felt very English, and the aspirations of the popular classes, the poorest ones. But one thing is certain, the military training of Juan Domingo Perón definitively shaped his political vision. He joined the army at a very young age. Perón was trained in an institution that in Argentina had not only a defensive function but also a political, social, and educational one. The army in Argentina was conceived as the guarantor of national unity and as a corrective, as an instrument of intervention for the flaws of civilian politics. This vision, common to many Latin American officers of that period, encouraged in Perón a conception of the state as the central actor in economic and social life. But what was fundamental for Perón was his stay in Europe between 1939 and 1941. During that period, Perón closely observed the authoritarian regimes of the time, especially fascist Italy. Liberal historiography has often emphasized this episode to support an alleged, let's say, ideological affiliation. Peronism and fascism. However, more recent studies suggest a more cautious interpretation. Perón did not import an absolute ideological model into Argentina, but rather drew pragmatic ideas, especially regarding union organization, social policy, and the relationship between the state and the masses. His doctrine, justicialism, the third position between Western liberalism, capitalism, and Soviet socialism, was more a flexible set of principles adaptable to circumstances that favored social harmony and the arbitrating role of the state, the Argentine state. But what was Argentina like in the period prior to the rise of Juan Domingo Perón to power? Between the end of the 19th century and the crisis of 1929, Argentina experienced extraordinary economic growth based on an agro-export model integrated into the world market, especially with Great Britain. This model had favored the formation of a powerful land-owning oligarchy, while the state remained weak on the social level. The Republican political system was characterized by a high level of social exclusion. The extension of suffrage, which took place in 1912 with the Sáenz-Peña law, had opened up spaces for participation, allowing the rise of the radical civic union. But it had not radically changed the economic and social balance. In short, the urban working classes, rapidly growing due to industrialization, they remained fragmented and politically marginal. The global crisis of 1929 marked a turning point. The collapse of international trade highlighted the vulnerability of the agro-export model. Therefore, the model was changed, shifting to an import-substituting industrialization immediately after the crisis. Here is a coup d'etat, the first of many, the one in 1930, which marks the beginning of the so-called infamous decade, characterized by electoral fraud, social repression, increasing economic dependence on foreign countries, and in this context, a crisis of political legitimacy and social transformation, which create the conditions for the emergence of a new figure. On the eve of the 1940s, Argentina therefore finds itself in a paradoxical situation. It is a country that is relatively developed economically, but politically blocked, socially dynamic, but institutionally unable to integrate the new urban masses. The army, which is the traditional arbiter of Argentine politics, presents itself as one of the few actors capable of intervening. That's when Mingo Perón emerges right in this space, a well-defined space, and he emerges with a coup d'etat, he too. It's June 1943. The group promoting this coup is the Grupo de Oficiales Unidos, which puts an end to the regime of the infamous decade. The military intervention is not initially motivated by an advanced social project, but it's a mix of nationalism, anti-liberalism, concern for political instability, and a bit of everything. The turning point comes with the appointment of Juan Domingo Perón to the Secretariat of Labor and Welfare, a position that is quickly turned into a platform of power. Through an active policy of mediation in industrial conflicts, the introduction of collective contracts, wage increases, paid vacations, and insurance, Perón manages to build a direct relationship with the workers' movement. It is undeniable that between 1943 and 1945, Perón managed to fill that gap in representation and establish himself as a recognized leader. But something happens right in this very particular period, and it's not just the meeting between Juan Domingo Perón and Eva Duarte. His future wife avoids what will give rise to a legend, one that will be retold in theater shows, musicals, and films. The founding event is that of October 17, 1945. A few days earlier, on October 12, Juan Domingo Perón was placed under arrest by his own colleagues, the military. These are conservative sectors of the army who, supported by the economic elites, decided to put an end to the Peronist experiment, which was considered excessively dangerous. Perón's arrest lasted very little. just a week. On October 17, 1945, a spontaneous mobilization of the descamisados occupied Plaza de Mayo in Buenos Aires. Demanding Perón's release, they make history. This event is considered the official baptism of Peronism. For Peronist historians, October 17, 1945, represents the people's sudden entry onto the political scene, the birth of a new social citizenship. For critics, on the other hand, it would be a manipulated demonstration made possible by Union control and the institutional weakness of the state. Freed and back on the political scene, Perón wins the 1945 presidential elections. In February 1946, he wins against an extremely heterogeneous coalition, liberals, socialists, conservative forces all against him. Yet he manages to win. Why? Because Perón, in his electoral campaign, brings together the two opposing visions of Argentina. The fact that liberal democracy doesn't work, and that yes, it's necessary to include the working classes, a national social reform, but without ending up in the extremes that have been seen in Europe, on the right or on the left. So the third way arrives, justicialism, and the first Perón government begins, the one that goes from 1946 to 1952, a government based on a well-defined political project, welfare state, consensus, and power. For the first time in the contemporary history of South America, a government is explicitly based on the organized support of the urban working classes. The Peronist project is not a reform or a social revolution in the classic sense, but a profound reform of the state structure and the relationship between business and labor. It is the so-called third position, the alternative, a sort of laboratory, a precursor to what will become the Third World Movement. The economic policy of the Perón government benefits from a favorable international situation. The reserves accumulated during the Second World War allow the Argentine state to finance an ambitious program of economic intervention. There is, for example, the establishment of Argentine Institute for the Promotion of Trade, the Argentine Institute for the Promotion of Trade, which allows Argentina to control foreign trade on the front of social policy and labor rights. Here, too, pre-Peronism carries forward a clear doctrine. Recognition of labor rights, extension of Social Security, paid vacations, collective bargaining, everything changes, and it seems to change for the better. According to many historians, it is Eva who influences the choices of Juan Domingo Perón, playing a crucial role in this process, embodying an emotional and symbolic mediation between the state and the poorest sectors. Evita is deeply loved by Argentinians, but this very figure, so beautiful, so powerful, so evocative, will conversely be the beginning of the end of the first Peronism. Despite the consolidation of consensus, despite the reforms, Eva Duarte de Perón actually represents one of the most emblematic and forceful aspects of Peronism. Coming from a humble provincial family who arrived in Buenos Aires in the 1930s to pursue an artistic career, Eva understands the value of communication and symbolic representation. She becomes an icon. Through the Eva Perón Foundation, Evita develops a vast system of social assistance, distribution of aid, and scholarships. That's why she is so loved by the people. But her illness, cancer, which strikes her at the beginning of the 1950s and leads to her death in 1950. Shortly after her husband's re-election, it marks not only an emotional loss for the president, but above all the disappearance of a key figure in maintaining popular support and social mediation. The second government, however, which lasts until 1955, begins in a very different context. On the economic front, Argentina's exclusion from the Marshall Plan causes a slowdown in the economy and the country's industrialization process. In this context, structural problems become evident. Inflation starts to rise more and more. The difficulties in foreign trade and the increasing tax pressure on businesses are being felt. Perón reacts with a kind of administrative authoritarianism. He tries to impose himself. Bad idea. Just like the conflict with the Catholic Church is a bad idea. A conflict that explodes in 1955 and leads the clergy to side against Peronism, along with many other opponents. The turning point is 1955, which marks the end of the first Peronist cycle with a double military coup. The first, in June 1955, ends badly. Naval officers try to kill the president during a public demonstration. Navy planes bomb a square where Perón is supposed to give a speech. But Perón isn't there. He's late. Only a massacre happens. A few months later, what will be called the Revolución Libertadora actually takes place. Perón is overthrown. In his place, a first military junta takes power. They make some drastic decisions. First of all, Peronism is completely banned. The death penalty is reinstated even for civilians, a measure that, among other things, will remain in effect until 1984. There will no longer be free elections because several parties are banned. Historians are quite divided in defining the Revolución Libertadora. There are some, like Tulio Alperindongui, who describe the Revolución Libertadora as a necessary evil, because after all, according to them, Perón was nothing more than a populist caudillo, a dictator who concentrated power, manipulated consent, and controlled the unions. Other historians, like Norberto Galasso, emphasize Perón's commitment to poor workers, so they speak not of a revolution, but only of a military coup. Perón is forced to go into exile. He first moves to Paraguay, then to Panama, where he meets another artistic figure, Isabelita, who also worked in a nightclub like Evita, and she too will become the wife of Juan Domingo. From Panama, he travels to Venezuela, but you can't trust anyone there due to a coup d'etat. Juan Domingo Perón has to take refuge in the embassy of the Dominican Republic, and from there, he escapes to the Dominican Republic itself, where he stays for a while as a guest of the local dictator Trujillo. Afterwards, Spain, and it's in Spain that Perón undergoes a change. Meanwhile, his movement and Peronism are splitting between more moderate factions, the old guard, and more radical ones, youth movements and labor movements. Perón moves more and more to the right, partly due to the influence of Francisco Franco, and partly because he realizes that American politics, the United States, the Monroe Doctrine, Roe, are making their presence felt in South America. And acting as an independent leader can be costly. It can send the wrong message, that of being basically a puppet of Moscow. In Argentina, during Perón's exile, which is very, very long, several things happen: repression, arrests, torture, restrictions on personal freedom. The Peronist movement continues to survive, but underground. We have to wait until the early 1970s for something to really change, for Perón to have a new chance, a chance. It doesn't manifest itself independently, nor does it manifest itself spontaneously. The chance comes thanks to the first general elections, which are called on March 11, 1973. Perón is ineligible. He is prevented from running. In his place, voters choose the candidate of the Justicialist Party, Héctor José Cámpora, a left-wing Peronist who gets almost 50% of the votes. As soon as he takes office, Cámpora resigns because he wants to pave the way for new elections, because he wants to bring Juan Domingo Perón back home. Perón finally has the chance to return to Argentina, but something terrible happens. On the day of his return to Buenos Aires, June 20th, 1973, about 3 million supporters gather at Ezeiza Airport to wait for the plane. That plane is redirected to another base because in the meantime, Ezeiza is shaken by a fierce protest that turns into a massacre. The two Peronist factions clash, the left wing and the right wing. The right wing faction is orchestrated by a man we will get to know next month in another of our videos, José López Rega, the head of the AAA. It is López Rega who orders his men to shoot at their opponents, causing 13 deaths and 300 injuries. This is not good news for Perón. Perón runs for office supported by the right-wing Peronists. Cámpora, feeling cornered, tries in some way to change his mind, to make the old Juan Domingo understand that it's time to change, to go back to the past. Perón doesn't trust him. He runs for office, wins the elections on September 23, 1973 with 62% of the votes, and appoints his wife Isabelita as vice president. It seems that the time machine has worked, that Juan Domingo Perón, even though he's now old, can still do something for Argentina. His problem is that he no longer has his hands free, like he did in the 1940s and the early 1950s. Now he is tied hand and foot to a system of power that is no longer under his control. There are too many powerful men in the Casa Rosada. There are too many men trying to manipulate him. Perón is already old, he is sick, he has chronic ischemic heart disease with heart failure. Still, he tries to do something. During the celebrations for Labor Day on May 1st, 1974, Perón, in a square half filled with supporters of the Peronist left, the so-called Montoneros, is supposed to give a positive signal to try to mend the country. Perón had already prepared a speech about trade unionism, but he is convinced to give up that speech and instead launches a violent tirade against the Montoneros. From that moment on, the Montoneros themselves, the Peronist left, realize they have become a minority and that they will be forced into hiding. Shortly after, on July 1st, 1974, when Mingo Perón suddenly dies in his villa at Quinta de Olivos in the Buenos Aires area. It is an acute myocardial infarction that kills him. A huge crowd attends his funeral in Buenos Aires. In his place, Isabelita takes office as interim president until the end of the term. But Isabelita is even weaker than her husband. She too is manipulated for almost 2 years by power-hungry men from Lopez Rega on down. On March 24, 1976, with the arrest of Isabelita Perón and her departure into exile, the Peronist era in Argentina comes to an end. An era ends and another begins, shorter but much more bloody. The era of the military junta, first under Jorge Rafael Videla and then under Galtieri. It is a dark era, the era of the desaparecidos, of underground concentration camps, of the massacre of an entire generation, of the mothers and grandmothers of Plaza de Mayo who loudly demand justice and truth. But that is another story. It's a story that maybe we'll tell you another time. Here, instead, we'll close with a final judgment on the political figure of Juan Domingo Perón, a complex, controversial figure, a social innovator in words, a defender of workers, a promoter of social justice policies, capable of gathering strong popular support, of generating a political dimension never seen before, but also a man with a strong authoritarian tendency, who reveled in the cult of his own personality and also relied on the cult of personality of his wife, first Evita and then Isabelita. Unable to mediate between the internal factions of Peronism, at times supporting one, at times the other, using them like puppets. Perón's policies, although initially effective, never managed to stabilize the country in the long term, and this only served to fuel divisions and conflicts. In summary, Juan Domingo Perón can be considered a charismatic and transformative leader. His social impact was enormous, but his handling of internal tensions and polarization, which he initially claimed he did not want to apply, ultimately became part of his own political trajectory. He left an ambivalent legacy, significant for the people who still remember him fondly today, despite all his contradictions. Problematic for institutional stability? In some ways it can be said, and on this historians are almost all in agreement, that Domingo Perón, with his trajectory, his choices, and his strategies, more or less unknowingly laid the groundwork for the fall of Isabelita, and for the birth of that military dictatorship which became known for its brutality, and certainly not for the bright, beautiful, attractive image of an Argentina that, in the post-war period, had become a safe haven. Also for many Europeans, also for many Italians, who were looking there for a new life, a better life, in the shadow of the sun, among the wheat of the pampas, and benefiting from the social policies that a caudillo, a demagogue, a president, a man named Juan Domingo Perón.